sound design and digital composition and performance. Its recent creative projects exploring corpus-based aesthetics of transformation have been selected for Sonority's Festival, XCOAX, hope we all know what that is, and the Edinburgh International Film Festival, and includes releases on the Superpang experimental music label. Today presenting a paper titled Composing Space, Immersion and Interaction in a Large-Scale Virtual Audiovisual Installation. So, over to you, Jules.
Thanks, Merlin. I think you should all be able to see my slides now. XCOAX, by the way. So XCOAX is the Conference on Communication, Computation, Aesthetics and X. And so that's a really interesting way to think about the various things that I'm going to tell you about now. So just a very quick intro. I run the game sound courses here at Edinburgh College of Art at the University of Edinburgh. And but my take on this is, while we do think about sound in games, is also we think about how we might use game engines and specifically game audio middleware for building artistic experiences as well. So Wind then is intended to be a very large-scale, immersive, interactive experience. Essentially an audiovisual composition or installation. I'm going to use that word composition quite loosely in that it's something that the user has to put together. So essentially it's exploring themes of indeterminate composition. There's some examples that I'm going to give of some of those things there. Also, as using this term installation, is that it is a virtual installation, that these things don't exist in real life. It is something that can only be experienced through a screen, either through a computer screen, but also have built it as a VR experience as well. So so first person experience intended to be, what can I do with these tools that I can't do in real life, and why? So a large part of my research is in the performance practice of electronic music and composition. And so essentially this is a study around the performance practice of virtual installations. It's a photorealist installation and an audio realist as well, in that it's kind of dealing with quite a there's a representational aspect of it, of saying this, you really are in this space, and people certainly in the VR version of it, do really think, wow, this is quite convincing as a space. And then ideas around, and specifically then these ideas of space, which I need to define a bit. So procedural space, essentially the space is generated through algorithms, and that there are a range of algorithms that are a function of space as well. So essentially I'm using X and Y to organize space in particular ways. And also to allow me to drive through particular parameters in the experience as well. Also then orchestrated space is how sounds are arranged in space through either their timbre, so essentially their tone color, and things to do with register as well. And then these ideas then of playful space, mediated space, essentially that you're getting sensory input from the space and that you make proactive responses to the space as well. I think the next slide should be a walkthrough, and what I've realized I need to do is to probably stop sharing and turn on use the sound as well. So I'm just going to stop that for a moment and come back. Sorry, because I forgot to hit include the sound. There we go. So what you don't really get from that as a space is the fact that it's really very large. It's about 500 meters square in real life, and that's one of the drivers for this, is that one of the things that I'm able to do in this kind of an environment is to create an installation at scale that you would not be able to generally stage in real life, because it's 5 soccer pitches large in terms of scale. There's a number of motivations here. The first thing being actually that I'm quite closely aligned with the range of the digital humanities people here at Edinburgh, and in particular research collections. And so building something interactive from archival material, something that would be playfully immersive. It's a walking simulator then built with Unity and Wise, and it brings these sounds, images and interactions together at a scale. So as I've said, 500 meters square. The images themselves are at least 3 meters tall. In real life, they're quite large. So inside of a headset, you really get a sense of how large this space is. And ideas then of this mediated space are that the sound itself is a transmitter of space. The user is a receiver of space, that together you end up negotiating your way through this environment. And there's a range of interpolations that happen both in the user and in the environment as well. So the various features, I'm working with machine learning and transformations, AI transformations using StyleGAN of images of musical instruments. You'll see some in a moment. These things create imperfect simulacra. Part of what I'm doing is working with various synthesis systems developed at Edinburgh Uni to try to imagine what these simulacra then sound like. There's various features that follow the audio in terms of how smeared and distorted the images are, and how smeared and distorted the sound is as a result inside of there. So here's some of these images then. Basically, Edinburgh Uni has a very large collection of historical brass instruments. They're very wild. The brass instruments themselves are a range of mediated spaces. And these are some of the outputs from the StyleGAN. But it is an iterative process as well, that essentially I was generating images, feeding those back in to the model to really amplify the distortions even more than you might otherwise get. So something working with our brass instruments there. Also other tools that kind of range around feedback. So the space itself is a feedback space. So I've mentioned some of these inspirations. There's some listed here. So key ideas though are around spatial orchestration, open sonic form, harmonic and timbral ambiguity, that in terms of the way the instruments function, the way the sounds function, things to do with depth and dimension, staging and presence, and so on. So we'll see some of these things. So Habenstock Ramati, interpolation, this is an open score. Essentially it's fragments of musical parts that people play in any order. Griepen by Stockhausen, which is 3 simultaneous orchestras, and the audience sit in the middle of this. So again, there's a kind of a mediation that happens there in terms of you trying to unpack and unpick the various sounds that are coming at you from 3 sides. Cornelia Parker in particular, the idea that you have to walk around her artworks to fully experience them from a range of different perspectives, including her work with crushed brass instruments here, range of things here. Kathy Hind, who's a UK artist, sound artist, dealing with staging and presence, often of quite physical examples. This was actually in our fire station here at Edinburgh College of Art, Shilpa Gupta. And the microphones that you can see hanging down here are actually speakers. So this was about the closest that I came to of an example of very many speakers in space, but there are not that many. Samson Young and Refik Anadol as well, to kind of dealing with the stage of things and themes of transformation. There's a range of presence causing form variables here. I'm not going to really get into them too much because we're interested in the space itself, but they're listed there, and it's to do often with how many things are in here, what the features of dimensionality are and color, and how we experience the space as well. Okay, so here's some screenshots then. You've already seen the walkthrough of it as a space. Um, but just in terms of the rigor of developing it, as I was going, I tried a range of other things, and the darkness as a mediating feature, is a really important part of this. The fact that you can't really see much beyond maybe 10 or 15 meters in real space, and that you have to, because it is a maze of sorts, you're constantly trying to make out where am I, where can I go, and there's these clusters and pockets of open space, almost like walking through a wood. That if as soon as you remove that darkness, the whole thing just falls apart as an experience, which was quite interesting. So there's a range of features in this then that deal with this large number. So when I say a large number, there's about 500 of these canvases hanging in space. They're double-sided. There's a number of other exhibits in there as well. There's no single view of or point of audition in any of these things, and it is a comprehensible labyrinth. Eventually you can make sense of it, which is a term from Fencott. So I'm going to talk about his ideas about perceptual opportunities here, in that how he deals with ideas of attractors, connectors and retainers in virtual environments, things that essentially grab your attention and say, come to this place, or things in environments that are able to say, well, now you're in this place, why don't you go to this other place? And here's the path through to doing that. Or something that simply wants you to stay in that place for a while as well. The other key idea of then mediated space is that it's a navigable space, which comes from Manovich, the idea that there is perception and motion through this space. On the left, what you can see is actually a map of the space with these kind of clusters and pathways. I've used a Perlin noise distribution to generate these clusters and holes. And what that means then is it gives a forced spatial interaction, that you can't walk straight through the canvases, you have to walk around them. And that leads to ideas of ergodic musicking, which is a term from Oliver, which comes from the idea of ergodic literature, which is a fairly well-known kind of gaming term, I guess. So in terms of narratology, the idea that there is effort expended in trying to traverse this landscape of sound and music. In terms of how that's realized as this mediated space is actually to do with differing levels of perception of the audio. So attached to each of the canvases is a very highly localized audio emitter that's appropriate to the image itself. I'll show how that's done. But they are of varying dynamic character and type of sound as well. So essentially, as you're moving around this space, you create your own kinetic structure, in that the sounds themselves are moving, because sounds moving is what happens through time, but they're also moving in space as well as a result of you moving. They require participative effort, and you as a user construct the experience with it. There are quite subtle audio effects as you move around the space in terms of Doppler effects, granulation, kind of odd delays, and so on, that again lead to it being quite a playful space. Just to give a view about this appropriate thing, once I generated the images using artificial intelligence, I then had to use machine learning to categorize the sounds into a grid, allowing me to attach the right kind of sound back to these newly generated images again. We don't care about that. It's just some screen of code that says, when the player stops moving, stop the sound. Associated with these highly localized emitters then, and so by highly localized, about 3 meters you can hear the sound, which is not very far at all, are these very large overhead instruments of brass instruments. They're highly saturated, super saturated, significantly larger than life, and that unlike the varying stability of these very localized sounds, these things are very stable sounds, and they transmit for a really long way, about 250 meters, so about half the environment. But I've organized the instruments such that you get a very orchestrated timbral sense. So flutes have a very pure tone, a saxophone is very raucous. So let's put those things together so you get something that's raucous and pure at the same time, and you're splitting up the the register, the pitch in those kinds of things as well. And you can actually start to navigate using these sounds that carry quite far. This gives you a sense of where these things are, how they also point at each other as well. So you can actually use the space. I often look up and say, oh, right, I'm underneath the trombone. And so the fastest way for me to get to somewhere is now to follow the trombone to a particular place. Some images from my WISE project. Nobody cares about these things right now.
That's you with 15 minutes, just so you know.
Okay, that's great. I'm nearly there. There are some things in there that are out of place, though, that act as switches and filters. They trigger different states in the experience, so that as you trigger these things, the whole, or the character of the work changes. So yes, just to sum up, essentially there are these things to do in here with visual staging. The structured and random use of sound in here as well, because there's hundreds of sounds in there, and it actually rebuilds itself anew each time you play it. There's these motion and proximity based mechanics that lead to a mediated space. I've had some nice feedback around it, and yeah, some key I think points to come out of this around how we can use agency and presence in virtual environments for quite self-consciously artistic artworks. And that's the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm going to do the clapping. Even if it's just me clapping. Fantastic work. Fascinating. Also really interesting deconstructions and reconstructions of sound. We might talk a bit about labyrinths, but moving on.